Good afternoon. My name is Stanley Brubaker, and I'm the director of the Institute for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And I am delighted to join forces with Core 151 this afternoon and welcome you to this opportunity to listen to Jonathan SHAY on leadership, lessons from Homer. It's hard to imagine someone launching his career with better credentials than those of Dr. SHAY. Graduate of Lawrenceville Academy. Anybody here from Lawrenceville Academy? You know people who have graduated from there? Nice place. Harvard College, Columbia University, almost ABD is what we call it in academics. That's all but dissertation. Medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Another PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, this one in neuropathology. Residencies at the Mass General. That's like one of the very, very best, if not the best place to have a residency. Also a residency, another residency, New England Medical Center Hospital, assistant professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School. And then he suffered a stroke, a devastating stroke, and had to relearn some basic functions of living. And it was also, though, at this time that he realized, despite all of these wonderful credentials that he had, that his education really was profoundly deficient because he had never read Homer or Virgil or Dante, Aristotle, or Plato. So as part of his recovery, he read and reread these classics. And once he was then able to work again, returning now to become the staff psychiatrist with the Department of Veterans Affairs, it was through the lens of Homer that he gained insights into treating veterans that had eluded staff psychiatrists before. And actually, it was also by listening to their stories of combat, and regaining that consciousness of what it's like really to be in combat, that he gained insights into the Iliad and the Odyssey that had eluded the notice of most classicists. The result of this work was Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America, books that we have for sale outside. Some of you have had these works assigned to you in class, and I will just mention right now that Dr. SHAY will be available for signing your books in the lobby after our lecture this afternoon. These insights actually then gained the notice of the United States military, and so he has lectured on ethics and on leadership at the United States War College, Army and Navy War Colleges. He's also helped with the revisions of the leadership manual for the United States Army. The Command and General Staff produced Army Leadership Manual. And in 2007, he was given a MacArthur Genius Award. How many do you know the MacArthur Awards? These are awarded to 20 individuals from all walks of life who receive notice with simply a telephone call that they have been selected. And they will be kept supported financially for the next 5 years to do whatever they want. So this is what academics dream of. So of course all of us academics know what those are. So before we get started here, I do want to ask, how many of you here have read either the Iliad or the Odyssey? Can you please raise your hands? Well, if I had asked this question at Princeton or Harvard or Yale, there would have been a fraction of the audience raising their hands. So it is with enormous pride that I have you to introduce to Dr. SHAY and Dr. SHAY to bring to you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan SHAY.
Thank you, Professor Brubaker, for that very, very kind and generous introduction.
I worked for 20 years with combat veterans, basically all of them from the Vietnam War, with very severe chronic psychological injuries that had wrecked their lives and the lives of their families. And for about the last 15 years, I retired from clinical work about 2 years ago. But for about the last 15 years, I have put myself out in the world as a missionary from those veterans that I have served in the clinic. A missionary to the U.S. Armed Forces. I've also kibitzed with the Canadian Forces and the Bundeswehr and the Royal Marines in the UK. But primarily with the American Forces on prevention of psychological and moral injury in military service. It's quite remarkable to discover that this missionary pitch, veterans I've served don't want other kids wrecked the way they were wrecked, so listen up, and this is how to protect them. And it's an effective pitch. I get a hearing. I cannot point to anything that has my thumbprints on it and say, I did that. That wouldn't have happened except for me. And we'll get to part of why that is, and it's actually, there's nothing scandalous about that. But the fact is, I do get a hearing. I performed a study in '99 and 2000 for the Marine Commandant General Jones, who was President Obama's national security advisor. And most recently, I had the rather grand title Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership at the U.S. Army War College. So I get a hearing, and that's pretty cool. What I can say is that the Homeric narratives really have an address in the heads of military people. The Homeric narrative fictions are experiments with the moral materials of military practice. Fictions, what Aristotle would have called poetry, are in general experiments with the moral materials of a society and its practices and of the human condition. The great fictions do not cook the books. The experiments have been honestly done. And the Homeric poems are amazing for how much they don't sugarcoat things. Although sometimes there are things that get said that you get the sense that they sort of had to be said in order to get the audience to let the poet in the door. Like, Odysseus isn't to blame. When your customer is a rich and powerful military commander, you don't lead with the card, boy, you guys really screwed up in your leadership role. But if you read the Odyssey carefully, you discover lots and lots of evidence that Odysseus has screwed up. Certain truths, especially in the realm of ethics, are best told through narrative fiction. Modern veterans are pretty much as able to weep for Patroclus and Achilles as ancient veterans. Now, some elements of the human condition are universal, but others are contingent on social practices. But I submit that as long as humans do engage in the practice of war, that these poems will have something to offer us. It's been my privilege to have these two books that were mentioned, and they carry living knowledge for us today. Not my books, but the two poems. And it's pretty amazing to me how large-spirited and generous the academic classicists have been, because I'm Greekless. I do not read Homeric Greek, and the classicists have been very generous in saying, you've helped us understand these ancient poems, and we thank you for it. It's amazing, right? In general, amateurs, and I'm an amateur, get savaged by the classicists. And they've done quite the opposite of savaging. Now, in particular, these two poems examine the social and ethical world of soldiers within the ecology of power in their own forces. I'm not ever going to tell you that what the enemy does in a war doesn't matter. Of course what the enemy does matters. But the conclusion that I have drawn from the 20 plus years working this territory is that the ultimate outcome as far as psychological injury goes depends much more on the social and ethical characteristics of the soldier's own forces than on what the enemy does or doesn't do. Of course it matters, but to take the Stoic position, we have to attend to the things that we have control over. And indeed, we have control over the characteristics of our own forces. Now, the epics can teach us flatly nothing in the way of weaponry, military planning, communications, tactics, organization, training, or logistics. But for those who go to war and return from it today, these poems still vibrate on the subject of cohesion, which is the bond between people who fight side by side. It's a face-to-face phenomenon. And on leadership, which is, of course, the main theme of today's talk. I speak a good many times a year with professional military audiences. And I just need to mention that I've been trying to put a new continent on the map of military ethics. Those of you who've had any formal encounter with the territory of military ethics know about jus ad bellum and jus in bello, what's right, just, equitable, and legal in the decision to go to war, jus ad bellum, and jus in bello, what is just, right, equitable, and legal in how you conduct yourself when you're in a war. But I've added a third continent, or been trying to, which might be called jus rei militaris, what's right, just, equitable, and legal in the internal conduct of military matters with regard to the people that inhabit this institution. My pitch is really pretty simple and pretty clear. And I know, and I tell my military audiences that I know, and that they should know I know, and I know that they should know, that nothing I have to say is new. that has all been said by military people themselves previously. And so to a certain degree, I'm engaged in a huge values reflection exercise. I'm holding up a mirror to them of their own ideals and aspirations for how they conduct themselves as military authorities, leaders, trainers. So I tell them that three things primarily protect the mind and the spirit of the good American kids we send into harm's way for our sake. And those three things are positive qualities of community in the face-to-face unit. The term for this in their world is cohesion. The second is expert, ethical, and properly supported leadership. And the third is prolonged, cumulative, and highly realistic training for what they actually have to do and face. So my mantra over and over again, cohesion, leadership, training. Cohesion, leadership, and training. These are the things that protect the mind and spirit of people you send into danger. Now, it's an easy sell to if the audience is line leaders and trainers, because they readily will say, well, Doc, we know about these, we want these too, because these are all combat strength multipliers. And that's a great moment always, because it gives me the chance to give them a theatrical, so why are you doing such a lousy job? And the fact is they know that on the whole they are doing a lousy job of getting cohesion, leadership, and training really right. And after a certain amount of shifting from buttock to buttock and looking at shoes, an answer from somewhere, often in the back, is, well, it's the personnel system. And in fact, that's not a cop-out, and there is a lot of truth in that. And I'm not going to lead you down into the weeds of military personnel policy, except to say that part of my missionary work has also been to the press, and through the press to the American people, to take an interest in this boring shit of the military personnel policy, because that's actually where the action is in protecting these kids. So I am making a pitch to you to take an interest, let people know in the local newspaper and on the internet that you want to know whether people are being kept together. You want to know what's happening in officer personnel management that would reflect on the ethical performance of officers. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. So my focus in this talk is on military leadership, specifically, as Homer shows us, military leadership by Agamemnon and Achilles and Odysseus. You have, I believe, a handout, and that handout was first used in an auditorium about as big as this middle section of the lower middle section of this auditorium here. And it was in the Naval Command Center in the Pentagon. And this auditorium is a secure facility, which meant that it had a door on it, and it looked, walking into it, it looked like you were walking into a walk-in freezer. I think they held various kinds of classified briefings in there. And the seats were entirely filled by Navy flag officers and Marine flag officers and various assistant secretaries from the Department of Defense and indeed the Secretary of the Navy. They came not to hear SHAY, they came to hear Homer. I can tell you that they were not there because somebody ordered them to be there, and they certainly weren't there for me. They were there because they wanted to hear some talk of Homer. And that's pretty amazing. Many of you have heard the apparently a fact. I wouldn't be able to reproduce the evidence that it's a fact, but it is widely believed that when Alexander the Great was campaigning, that he traveled with a complete scroll of the Iliad that allegedly he slept with under his pillow. And I believe he claimed to have been descended from Patroclus, but that part is foggy in my memory. So military people have very much continued to respect this text. Now, I don't for a moment want to blow off the Odyssey in this account. I'm not saying that the real poem here is the Iliad. And a scholar, you'll be able to guess his nationality, named Johannes Haubold, has written a lovely little monograph, a brief little book called Homer's People, in which he makes the point, and really nails it, that the one theme, and it's virtually the only theme that much of anybody has been able to discover, that links these two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are so different. They are not only so different, but in a certain sense there isn't a single scene that is shared between the two. It's almost like they're artificially constructed to be different. But the one theme that they share is the question about leadership. Is this leader a shepherd of the people? Now that's a Homeric phrase. Or is this leader a destroyer of the people? And that's also a Homeric phrase. And Haubold really nails it. The troops in the Iliad are almost always the laos. That's the word here for people, or troops in the Iliad. And Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, and Hector have a shepherd's fiduciary responsibility for their flocks, for their people. And unfortunately, all of these, as different as these four leaders that I mentioned, all of them fail catastrophically in separate ways and for different reasons, but they all fail as leaders. The Odyssey uses the word laos only rarely, and it refers to Odysseus's crews from Ithaca as companions rather than laos, and those who stay behind mainly are referred to as suitors. And yet, when the suitor Eurymachus pleads for the lives of his own life and everybody else there, using the word laos, the moment after Odysseus has put an arrow through the neck of Antinous, the most odious and villainous of the suitors. Eurymachus says, "Then spare your people, Laon, your own ones." And just before the brief final battle of the Odyssey in Book 24, Eupeithes, the father of the villainous Antinous, whips up his lynch mob. And he whips them up with the words, "First he took many excellent men away with him to Troy, and lost the hollow ships and destroyed the people." Laos. Hougold comments, he's not off base there. And when you think about it, one of the delicious things in Homer is seeing how the poet often puts the literal truth in the mouth of either a brute or a person that we're supposed to not believe. So that the Cyclops, for instance, says, "Who are you? Men raiding at random? Are you pirates?" That's exactly what they were. Exactly. And the poet puts this truth in the mouth of the Cyclops, who we're supposed to see as this great big lout. Now, the point of view of today's professional military officers is very much that Odysseus would be blameworthy for the loss of all his ships and crews, and that I've lost that Eupeithes is really stating literally, "Hey guys, this man here, Odysseus, has killed off 2 generations of Ithacan youth. First he takes 600 of them away in his ships to Troy, and not one of them comes back. He's the only guy who comes back alive. And now this guy is back in Ithaca, and he's wiped out another 124 of our best young men. So let's string them up." You don't have to evoke any fancy law of vendetta and say, "Well, it was so primitive, it didn't have a judicial system, yada, yada, yada." Odysseus really deserved stringing up. There's just no way to slice it. Now, there's a fairly recent book, 2003, by James Tatum, a wonderful book, and I offer you the discount from saying it's wonderful that he says some nice things about me in this book, but I swear that I would say it was wonderful anyway. He offers the argument that the Iliad's point of view is the point of view that the Iliad is written from the point of view of the excellent leader, and that in fact both Agamemnon and Achilles fall very short of this standard of the excellent leader. And it's actually only after I reread Homer's People that I saw this. And the key to it is the fiduciary duty embodied in the expression shepherd of the people. Now, a lot of, especially academics, would be screaming bloody murder and saying, anachronism, you're putting your modern values on this ancient poem. But without marching you through the evidence, I just refer you to Hougold's book, where he nails that in fact the Iliad text and the Odyssey text both hold a leader to a fiduciary duty for their people. And I'll just finish that point right there. Now, in the Iliad and Demodocus's first song in Odyssey Book 8, sorry, I have a bit of esophageal reflux, and I'm afraid that lovely baklava has clouded my voice. I'm going to put the mic down and open the bottle. Sorry about that. Maybe it's a lot better. In the Iliad and Demodocus's first song in Odyssey 8, we see Agamemnon as an almost perfectly bad leader. And it's quite amazing. Except for, and it's an important exception, he was personally brave, and he shared the lethal risks of combat with the rest of his forces. Agamemnon was not orbiting at 6,000 feet in his helicopter, shouting orders into the radio to his troops down in the mud. He was down there in the mud fighting with them and actually takes a wound. But, and here I'm going to go into a bit of detail in a passage that those of you who have read the Iliad probably will remember, and will remember having scratched your head about what the dickens is going on here. And that is that the episode in Iliad 2, which is known to scholars as the Diapera, or the test, but which I give my own label, the stampede to the ships. Well, here's what it looked like. This test came the day after, the next day, after Agamemnon had publicly dishonored Achilles by seizing his prize of honor, his Geros. And that prize of honor, you will remember, was a captive woman named Briseis. Okay, Achilles probably did really like Briseis, but what went between Agamemnon and Achilles wasn't a fight between two soldiers over a girl. It was about honor. The whole tragedy of the Iliad has been kicked off in Book 1 by Agamemnon's breathtaking twin violations of the army's moral order. The first, which tends to just sort of recede into forgetfulness, was the disgusting way he treats the priest of Apollo at the very opening of the poem. Now, here again, when I say the disgusting way he treats the priest of Apollo, is this Shay putting his 21st century values into this ancient poem? The evidence of the text is the poet allows us to hear the mutterings of the truth. Respect the priest. Accept the ransom that he's offering you. Respect the priest. Accept the ransom. The poet has us hear the voices of the army, so that when Agamemnon crudely and viciously dismisses the priest without accepting the ransom and giving him back his daughter and telling him that he's going to kill him if he ever shows his face in the beachhead again, we know that this was a violation of the moral code of Agamemnon's army. And the priest of Apollo, having the god's ear, prays for Apollo, who you recall is the god both of healing and of plagues. So that two-sided picture. It's not just strictly the classics comics version where the gods were all of the good things. So Apollo calls down this devastating plague on the Greek army, and as the poet says, the funeral pyres burned day and night. It's Achilles who steps forward to try and get a diagnosis and to provide a treatment. And in that context, he tangles with Agamemnon. I won't march through the exact story, but it ends with Agamemnon having to accept the ransom, to send his captive, who was his Geras of an earlier day, back to her father. And then he turns on Achilles and said, I'm going to take your Geras. And Achilles almost drags him. And famously, the goddess Athena grabs Achilles by the hair and jerks his head around and says, no, you're not going to do that. And Achilles, who throughout the poem is always shown to be obedient to the gods, doesn't frag Agamemnon. He just insults him a few times and stalks away. So this test of the army happens the day after this near fragging of Agamemnon. And this test is totally bizarre. And he tells his officers that he's going to pretend to give up the war. It's one of the nuttiest things in the annals of military leadership, whether real or fictional. He says to his officers, we'd better move it if we're going to get the men ready. But I'm going to test them first with a little speech. You know, the usual drill, order them to beat a retreat to the ships, and it's up to you to persuade them to stay. This is Stan Lombardo's translation with my emphasis. Apparently, Agamemnon has done this enough times before that it seems normal, and nobody says to him, that's a really bad idea. His chief of staff, Odysseus, never says, boss, you sure you want to do that? And then with the whole army mustered, Agamemnon stands up before them and says that even though they came ashore with a 10-to-1 force advantage over the Trojans, that Zeus has decreed that they will fail after so much struggle and sacrifice. Now, this is what I say, and I want us all to obey. Let's clear out with our ships and head for home. There's no more hope we'll take Troy. And then, as one person, the whole army stampedes for the ships. And there's an incredible simile in there that just paints the picture of the whole army just running across the undulating land toward the shore. Apparently, this takes everybody by surprise, because Agamemnon has pulled this dumb trick before, and the troops have always said, hey, we're here for the duration. What are you talking about? You're crazy. We're here. We're going to take down Troy. But this time, the outcome is different. Agamemnon is surprised, the Greek officers surprised, and even the gods are surprised. But should we be surprised? And I submit, no, that this is exactly the predictable result of a betrayal of what's right by a leader in a high-stakes situation. Motivation, loyalty, perseverance go whooshing out of the troops like air out of a balloon that's just been either cut open or let the valve open. Troops will desert psychologically, even if they cannot desert physically. The stampede to the ships carries one of the Iliad's most important lessons for military leaders, and I would expect also for any leader. The command climate, which is a military term, is not the weather report of the atmospherics in the boss's office or in the tactical operations center. Command climate is the observed trustworthiness of how power is employed. The trustworthiness of how power is employed. That's command climate. What Agamemnon did to Achilles was not a private wrong. There are no private wrongs in the use of military institutional power. Everybody is watching the trustworthiness of the person that has power over them. And they're watching all the time, the fishbowl effect of leadership. Now, if anyone had had the nerve to ask, Agamemnon would have said, "This is none of your business. This is strictly between me and Achilles." Of course he'd say that. But would he be right? No. Any military leader who violates what's right in his use of power injures everybody in that unit, not just the target of the injustice. It is so difficult often for people to remember that when they acquire power in an organization, in a group, in an institution, that they lose the right to say it's a private matter because everybody's watching. And everybody gets demotivated by a violation of what's right. So Agamemnon had caused Achilles' desertion the day before. Remember, Achilles said, "If you're going to treat me that way, I'm out of here." And in fact, in that world, there was no way for Agamemnon to do anything but insult him a few times. He couldn't say, "MPs, arrest that man." The institutions, the concepts didn't exist, and Achilles was every bit as much an independent political contingent leader as, say, the commander of the Australian forces in Vietnam. So that Westmoreland could not have said, "MPs, arrest that man," and pointed to the Australian commander. If the Australian commander said, "Westy, we're out of here," Westmoreland would not have had the capacity, and Agamemnon did not have the capacity to legally, coercively restrain Achilles from taking his marbles and going home. So Achilles had deserted the day before, and today the whole army deserts. That's what this stampede to the ships is all about. So the three Homeric leaders contrast sharply in their relationships to their troops. Achilles, prior to the open of Iliad 1, and the evidence is enormous, had broad, other-regarding care for all of the troops, not just his own, And he's famous among them for his skill and interest in treating wounds, and it's he who steps in to end the plague. He leads by example, and he's lavish in his generosity to both peers and subordinates. He shows moral courage as well as physical courage. Odysseus is an interesting character. He motivates through eloquence and physical coercion. Later in the Odyssey, we see that he doesn't trust anybody but himself to do things right, even the simplest things. Remember in the episode with the King of the Winds, Odysseus's ships are given the perfect following wind, and Odysseus doesn't trust a sailor for 9 days and 9 nights to take the sheet and the tiller while he gets some sleep. So Odysseus doesn't trust anybody, and we see him habitually lie to and withhold information from his troops. And we watch him in the catastrophic episode with the Lystrigonians watch him take them into needless. The episode with the Lystrigonians, he's taken steps to protect themselves. My tongue is broken here. He has taken steps to protect himself, but doesn't lift a finger to protect them. So he apparently regards this very steep-walled fjord that the other 11 ships pull into and then collapse into sleep on the decks of their ships, on the benches of their ships. But he parks outside the fjord, and he doesn't say a word to anybody. My conjecture is that he just doesn't like the look of this. This is a death trap, is why he parks outside. A charitable explanation is that he was going to be on guard against all the rest of them being surprised, but that sort of doesn't hold water in the description of the setting. Odyssey 8 gives us another glimpse of Agamemnon's disastrous leadership when Demodocus sings of Agamemnon gloating over the clash between Achilles and Odysseus. According to an ancient scholiast, they were arguing over the relative values of Bia, violent force or firepower, and Metis, cunning tricks and strategies. And you could add technical intelligence gathering and to that kind of thing. The bard sings about how this insecure and incompetent commander absolutely delights in seeing his best subordinate officers at each other's throats. The Iliad's Agamemnon is an almost perfectly bad leader. Achilles was an almost perfectly good leader prior to the opening of our Iliad. The poem hits the ground running, so whatever we learn about Achilles' character and activities prior to the opening of the poem, it's salted through the poem, here, there, and everywhere. But it's not given to us as something that scrolls down the screen saying, Episode 7, this is what happened before. So I'm going to wrap with a portrait of Achilles as a leader and limit myself to his pretty much purely military capacities. He had operated over Lesbos, Scoros, Tenedos, Lyrnessus, Pedasus, and Thebe. And apparently, according to one very prominent Iliad scholar and commentator, every stick of booty in the Greek camp had apparently been brought there by Achilles. Now, the Greek expeditionary force, Achilles had sacked 23 cities in the neighborhood of Troy to do this. The Greek expeditionary force had arrived at Troy with overwhelming numerical superiority, technological parity, and with the characteristic logistical worries of any amphibious operation. The Normandy invasion had the same kind of logistical problems, and fortunately it came out okay. Foraging and pillaging were one traditional solution to the logistical problem. Commercial contracting with goods paid for by booty were yet another, and that's in the Iliad. The getting the booty to pay the contractors appears to have been the main point of Achilles' local raiding. So he was supporting the whole force. However, the Greeks failed to tie a tight blockade around Troy while solving their logistical problems. Famine never torments Troy during the long years of siege. So the siege must have been really permeable. The text gives direct evidence of an even more important military failure. Agamemnon has allowed so much coming and going from Troy that King Priam can assemble a formidable alliance and beat this. These troops of the alliance are quartered inside the town. Now, just wrap your mind around that. This is a town that is supposed to be invested by a siege, and yet over a period of 9 years, enough Allied troops have been infiltrated through the siege into the town that the Trojans now have parity in force. What kind of a siege is that? But then Agamemnon says, but the allies are here. From many Asian countries come these lances, and it is they who hedge me out and hinder me from plundering the fortress town of Troy. But the allies are here. Agamemnon speaks like there's some kind of natural phenomenon, perhaps an uncharted reef that his ships have struck. He takes no responsibility. This, I submit, is the history, the backstory of the hair-trigger anger that Achilles displays with Agamemnon. We can imagine Achilles' earlier reproaches. He has returned, bloody, filthy, and exhausted to the beachhead after every one of the 23 raids in the neighborhood, bringing supplies, only to discover that Agamemnon, who's the commander of the static siege force, this is the military situation here, has allowed yet more enemy forces through the blockade. I can tell you tempers run very high among commanders in the field if they have fundamental military differences. The stakes are mortal. Odysseus displays a mixture of both good and bad leadership in the Iliad. Odysseus is, as Homer says, polytropous, many-sided, mixed, multicolored piebald. He's a mixture of outstandingly good and outstandingly bad military traits. I'm suspecting that I'm running the clock out here, and I do want to leave time for ideas, questions, arguments. So I'm wondering, should I just ditch the discussion of Odysseus,
Why
or
don't you wrap here and then take questions? And
Okay.
They can ask questions about it.
I apologize for losing track of the clock. So let's take questions and comments and lay it on me.
I mentioned to Dr. Shay, emphasized to me, and the PPE rules, at least the first first three questions are reserved for students first here, so.
Yes.
When you were working with these Vietnam War veterans, how long did it take for them to really kind of open up to you and really share a lot of the details of kind of what they went through and on over there?
First of all, it was never just me. And the fact that the model was that the whole team developed cohesion of its own and demonstrated communication and trustworthiness within itself and mutual respect within itself. We were constantly role modeling the things that we were trying to get across to the veterans to do. So it was never a question of people opening up to me. They very well might be opening up to one of the other clinicians, but it was always that there were no secrets within the team. No veteran. The veterans knew that they had absolute confidentiality with regard to the world outside the program. But within the clinical team, we were going to share every bit of information that we believed was important, and that they were never going to be able to say to any of us, now don't tell anybody else on the team about this. That was out of bounds and essential to doing this kind of work. So still the question matters, and typically a veteran would just be watching for at least a year, sometimes 2 or 3, just watching what we did, what we said, and figuring out whether we were trustworthy. And then they'd stick a toe in the water and tell one of the clinicians, maybe on the way out the door, tell them something of importance and see what we did with it, and then extend their trust a little bit further. Yes, great question. Yes?
So do you believe Achilles' experience is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, or?
Well, there's no post there.
Well, traumatic stress.
He experiences profound grief. He goes into a state that eventually, even the gods say, yuck, when he goes on his murderous rampage. So he's definitely psychologically injured, but he doesn't live past the war. In general, the core primary injury, and by primary I don't mean most important, but the core injury that comes directly from being in a situation where other people really are trying to kill you and doing a damn good job of it. The primary injury is the persistence into life after danger of those valid adaptations to this real prior situation of other people trying to kill you. And PTSD is a good enough summary of what those adaptations are. That you shut down any emotions or activities that threaten survival in the real situation of other people trying to kill you. You hyper remember the signs of danger. Those are the intrusive symptoms. And the body and the mind are constantly mobilized for instant counterattack and mobilized for danger. So there you have the intrusive, the avoidant, and the causal clusters of the PTSD diagnosis. But that's such a poor picture of the real ways that people get wrecked by going to war. It's not that it's wrong, it's just that it's a very limited, and if it's strictly applied, following the definitions in the diagnostic manual to the letter, it leads to injustice after injustice. And just so that doesn't hang out there as an abstract statement, technically you have to ask a veteran, did you feel terror, horror, or I forget the other, but did you feel X, Y, or Z when your buddy was bleeding to death through severed arteries in his jaw when his jaw was shot away and you were futilely trying to stop the bleeding? And the veteran says, I didn't feel a fucking thing. I was just trying to stop the bleeding. Technically, you cannot assign a diagnosis of PTSD there. Now, most clinicians will find a way to do it, but if you were technically exactly right in how you made the diagnosis, you're not permitted to. So, yeah, I'm not going to get into a rant here about the diagnostic manual.
What is the military's reaction to these suggestions?
Reaction to my?
To your suggestions to their policies.
I'm still having trouble. You're dropping your voice at the business end of the question.
What has been the military's reaction to your suggestions to helping them change?
My attempt to change their reactions are that they invite me back, and sometimes things happen that look quite good, like for instance on the enlisted personnel management side. In the late 90s, the Marine Corps decided it was going to stabilize units, it was going to keep people together, it was going to train them together, send them to war together, and bring them home together. In the early 2000s, the Army did the same thing. And as I said, nothing I say is new. And this was all stuff that their own people have been saying, we got to do this, or we got to stop shuffling military units like decks of cards. In the 90s, the average soldier, junior enlisted soldier, would be in 7 different units in the course of a 3-year term of enlistment. This makes no sense in terms of creating unit cohesion in a combat arms unit. In any case, they said they really wanted to do this, they were doing it, it's the policy, and SHAY is nothing if not obnoxious. And I said, well, it's wonderful you got the idea right, but you, Marine Corps, are stabilizing, in quotes, units at the level of the battalion, and you, Army, are stabilizing, quotes, units at the level of the brigade. A Marine infantry battalion is about 700 Marines, an Army combat brigade is, depending on what it is about 3,500 soldiers. Way too large a group to get cohesion. Cohesion is a face-to-face unit, which I said over and over again, face-to-face phenomenon. It is not likely that cohesion is ever going to really be present in any group larger than a company, which is typically maybe 120, 130 in the infantry. And so I never ever know whether these services bring me in as window dressing or because they really want to hear what I have to say. Because I'm pretty good at window dressing. I have a lot of contacts in the press and the Congress, and they want me to say the Army is really getting things right now. And SHAY, being a great pain in the ass, rarely says that, if ever. Yes?
We know that one of the main problems that veterans face after the war is that when they come back home, things have changed. And we see that in the Odyssey, like when Odysseus comes back, he in fact cannot even recognize his homeland. He deals with that by...
What a great metaphor that is, yeah.
He deals with that by basically taking over his, kind of like attacking his homeland and taking over it. How do veterans nowadays, how do they deal with it? How do they cope with it?
You're literally right in what you just said, but remember, he's one guy and he's up against 120, 130 young bucks who all want him dead, and in fact have lined up an ambush for his son Telemachus so that he's dead too. Given the alignment of forces here, he's in a tough spot, and I'm not sure exactly what the alternatives are that you think were available. And now I've lost the thread. Repeat the...
The only way, one of the things is that the only way he deals with things is by taking over, like, that's the, and like, he even kills maids and everything in his house. My question is, like, how do veterans today, how do they deal with it? Do they face the same circumstance that when they come back, everyone's against them in some sort?
The question of everybody against a psychologically injured veteran, I want to say that we don't learn anything new or additional about a psychologically injured veteran by hanging the psychological term paranoid on it. It's better to stick close to the phenomenology. When your capacity for trust has been destroyed or impaired, what's left behind is not an empty vacuum of nothing. What's left behind is the active expectancy of harm, exploitation, and humiliation. You call that paranoid if you want, but that's what it is. And there are three generic strategies. And you see Odysseus using all of these. The first generic strategy is strike first. The second generic strategy is run and hide, or disguise yourself. And the third generic strategy is deception, lying, trickery. And boy, Odysseus, of course, is the king of metas, of cunning, tricks, and stratagems. So Odysseus is a very good example of a veteran who doesn't trust anybody. There's one person that he trusts without qualification, and that's his son Telemachus. And in a certain sense, that's very sort of evolutionary biology-ish of Odysseus, because Telemachus and Odysseus, their fates are totally joined. If Odysseus is dead, Telemachus is dead meat. And Telemachus knows this, Odysseus knows this, and their fates are one. They have a total alignment of interests objectively. And so Odysseus trusts him totally, even though once Telemachus lets him down, but it's an oversight, a sort of a slip. It's not an intentional betrayal of Odysseus' trust. Yes?
I guess just
Oh,
one
okay.
more question.
One more question. I really did run out of the clock. I apologize.
Mine's good.
It should-
Have you had a chance to
I have only a brief and rather limited clinical contact with current theater veterans. For 6 months, I filled in with a once-a-month medication group with current theater veterans at a VA clinic in the final 6 months of my VA work. And I'm the guy who wrote the book saying war is war is war is war and hasn't changed in 3,000 years. So you might not be surprised to hear that I didn't see all that much different about them. Might have been in me. Maybe there was lots different about them, but I didn't. So anyway, I'm the original Shameless and Obsessed author. I'm happy to sign books. You don't have to buy a book out there to get me to sign it if you happen to have it with you. Don't think that that's required. But I'm delighted to sign. I'll sign anything but a blank check.
Mine is not bad.
Lost track of the time.
Yeah, it was great. I think you chose well. I think it's much better.